There's a moment in episode 6 of the first season, TS-19, that stays with me. Dr. Jenner's explaining to Rick's group why there's no hope, why the CDC is the last place left, and he says something that sounds almost casual. The French were the last ones to hold out. Just that one line, no elaboration, no explanation. And then the conversation moves on, and we never learn what hold out actually meant. What were they holding out for? A cure they'd never find? Hope that was already gone? While Rick's group fought walkers in Georgia, while Shane made impossible choices and Laurie grieved, there were people in Paris doing the same, in Tokyo, in London, in cities we'll never see, making the same terrible decisions. Jenner's single line suggests the outbreak was global, that every country faced it, that governments everywhere tried to respond and failed. Each research facility that went silent represents millions of deaths. Thousands of communities trying different strategies, nations choosing control or compassion or collapse. The apocalypse wasn't uniform. It was fractured by borders, languages, cultures, by the choices countries made in those first desperate days. Tonight, let's trace those choices together, not with certainty, but with curiosity. Let's explore how the world fell, one country at a time. The United States fell fast, faster than anyone expected, faster than a superpower with the world's largest military and endless resources should have fallen. In Fear the Walking Dead, Season 1, we see the collapse in real time through the Clark family's eyes in Los Angeles. The military arrives, establishes quarantine zones, promises safety and order. And then, within days, Operation Cobalt is enacted. It's revealed in Season 1, Episode 5, Cobalt, that the military's plan isn't to save civilians, it's to execute them. Humane termination of everyone in the safe zones, infected or not, to contain the spread. Soldiers are ordered to kill the people they're supposed to protect. And when some refuse, when they choose their families over orders, the command structure collapses. Soldiers desert. Others shoot their commanding officers. The quarantine zones fall to chaos, and the military, the institution meant to be America's last line of defense, it just disintegrates. In the main show, we get Shane's perspective in Season 2. He tells Laurie and the group that Atlanta was bombed, that the military tried napalm strikes to contain the walkers, and it didn't work. The city burned, but the dead kept walking. And by the time Rick wakes up in Season 1, Episode 1, the government's completely gone. No FEMA, no emergency broadcasts, no rescue. Just silence, bodies, and a flag hanging limp outside an abandoned military checkpoint. The theory here, the pattern that emerges when you look at the timeline, is that the US fell so fast because the response prioritized control over survival. The government tried to maintain authority, to enforce order through military power. And when that power required killing civilians to preserve the chain of command, people stopped following orders. Trust broke. And without trust, without the belief that the people in charge are trying to help you, authority means nothing. Rick slept through his country's death. He was unconscious during Operation Cobalt, during the napalm strikes, during the moment the last government official gave up and went home to die with their family. And when he wakes, when he walks through that empty hospital and sees the military checkpoint with bodies in uniform scattered like broken toys, he's seeing the aftermath of choices he'll never fully understand. The emotional weight here is in what Rick missed. The moment America decided control was more important than compassion, and then realized too late that compassion was the only thing that could have saved it. The country with the most resources, the most powerful military, the most advanced technology. It fell first because it forgot that survival isn't about power, it's about trust. And Operation Cobalt killed trust faster than the virus killed people. That's the lesson the US learned too late. And it's the lesson every other country had to learn in their own way, in their own time. As the red dots on Jenna's map blinked out, one by one, France was the last one. That's what Jenna says in Season 1, Episode 6. And for years we didn't know what it meant. The French research facility stayed operational the longest, kept communicating, kept searching for answers while the rest of the world went silent. But then Daryl Dixon premiered, and we got to see France years after the outbreak. And the picture's more complicated than Jenna's brief mention suggested. In Daryl Dixon Season 1, France is overrun just like America. Walkers everywhere, communities struggling, survivors forming factions. But there's a difference. The survivors in France show signs of organization that lasted longer than the US equivalent. Dr. Genet and Pouvoir du Vivant, her authoritarian movement. They've got resources, infrastructure, a military hierarchy that's clearly been maintained for years. And that suggests France's collapse was slower, more controlled, that the government and research institutions had more time to plan, to adapt, before everything fell apart. The theory is that France's centralized research network and geographic advantages bought them time. France has island facilities, research labs on the coast, a centralized government system that could coordinate faster than America's fragmented federal state structure. When the outbreak began, France likely quarantined aggressively, used their islands as safe zones for research teams, and maintained communication longer because they had fewer competing authorities making contradictory decisions. In the US, you had federal, state, and local governments all trying different strategies, all undermining each other. In France, Paris made a decision, and the whole country followed, at least initially. That cohesion, that unity of response, it bought them weeks, maybe a month. Long enough for Jenna at the CDC to still be receiving transmissions, long enough for French researchers to make progress that others couldn't. But that extra time didn't save them. By the time we see France in Daryl Dixon, it's just as broken as America, maybe more so. Dr. Genet's fascism, her belief that only the strong deserve to survive and the weak should be eliminated, it's clearly born from France's long, slow fall. She's not a first-generation survivor like Rick or Shane, making reactive choices in chaos. She's someone who's had years to develop a philosophy, to build a movement, to decide that humanity's future requires cruelty and control. And that's the dark lesson of France's extra time. More time doesn't mean better outcomes. It just means more time to make terrible choices, more time for hope to curdle into desperation, more time for survivors to become the kind of people who'd rather rule ruins than share them. France held out the longest, but what they were holding out for, a cure, a return to normalcy, a way to rebuild the old world, it was never coming. And the extra weeks they spent searching for it just gave them more time to lose themselves. The emotional anchor here is in what those extra weeks cost. Somewhere in France, in those final days before the research facility went silent, scientists were working around the clock, believing they were close, believing the breakthrough was imminent. They sacrificed sleep, safety, maybe even their humanity, running experiments that in any other time would be unethical, because the apocalypse erased the old rules. And they failed. They found nothing. And when the facility finally went dark, when Jenner lost contact and realized the French were gone too, that was the moment hope died globally. Not when America fell, not when Asia went silent, but when France, the last one trying, the last one still searching, gave up. And the world Rick woke into, the world where survival is all that's left, it started the moment that last red dot on Jenner's map blinked out. The question isn't what France learned in those extra weeks. It's what they had to become to keep searching that long, and whether it was worth it. Geography killed more people than the virus did. That's the pattern you see when you look at which communities survived and which didn't. In Season 1, Rick's group is at a quarry outside Atlanta, isolated, mobile, away from population centers. They survive. In Season 7, we meet Oceanside, a coastal community hidden on the beach, and they've survived for years because of isolation. The Commonwealth, revealed in Season 10 and explored in Season 11, has 50,000 people, and it survived because it's in Ohio, away from major population centers, with walls and vetting protocols. The Civic Republic, shown in The World Beyond and The Ones Who Live, it's even larger, 200,000 people, and it survived because it's hidden, isolated, protected by geography and secrecy. The pattern's clear. Density killed, isolation saved. If you were in New York, Los Angeles, Atlanta, London, Tokyo, any major city, your chances of survival dropped to almost zero. But if you were in rural Montana, the Scottish Highlands, the Australian outback, you had a chance. The theory extends globally. Island nations, the UK, Japan, Iceland, New Zealand, they had a natural quarantine advantage. The virus spreads through contact, through bites and fluid exchange, and islands can control who arrives and who doesn't. If the UK shut down air travel fast enough, if they quarantined incoming ships, they could have contained the outbreak to whatever was already on the island. And with lower population density outside London, with a culture that already understood queuing and orderly behavior, the UK might have lasted longer than continental Europe. Japan's even more interesting. It's an island nation with collectivist culture, low gun ownership, and a population that's practiced mask wearing and social distancing for decades due to flu seasons. If any country had the cultural tools to slow the virus's spread, it'd be Japan. But we never see it. We never get confirmation. The show's US-centric, and that absence, the fact that we don't see Asian, European, or African survivors, it's not because they didn't exist. It's because the story we're watching is limited to one perspective, one corner of the apocalypse. Deserts and sparse regions had different advantages. In Africa, in the Middle East, in Australia's interior, the virus would spread slower because there are fewer hosts. Walkers need people to bite, to infect, to create more walkers. In a city, one walker can create 100 more in hours. In a desert, that same walker might wander for days without encountering anyone. The outbreak would still spread. Travelers, refugees, infected people, fleeing cities would bring it to rural areas. But the exponential growth that destroyed cities wouldn't happen as fast. The trade-off, though, is resources. The same isolation that protects you from walkers also cuts you off from supplies. In TWD, we see the Governor's Woodbury, Negan's Sanctuary, the Commonwealth. All of them survive by controlling trade routes, by taking resources from others. In a desert, there's nothing to take. You survive if you already know how to live with scarcity, if your culture's adapted to harsh conditions, nomadic groups, Bedouin tribes, Aboriginal Australians, they'd have a massive advantage over city dwellers who've never had to ration water or forage for food. The emotional weight of geography is in the unfairness. Your survival, your chances of living through the first weeks, it wasn't about your skills or your morality or your strength. It was about where you happened to be when the outbreak started. If you were in Manhattan, you died. If you were in rural Nebraska, you had a chance. And millions of people died, not because they made bad choices, not because they were weak or unlucky, but because they lived too close to other people, because population density turned every city into a death trap. Rick's group survives the quarry because Dale had an RV and they got out of Atlanta fast. Oceanside survives because they're on a beach, hidden, away from main roads. Alexandria survives because it's a planned community with walls, built in the suburbs before the outbreak. Geography shaped survival more than any government response, more than any individual choice. And that's the quiet tragedy. The apocalypse wasn't fair. It never pretended to be. Your zip code mattered more than your character, and millions learned that too late. Let's talk about culture, about the invisible structures that shape how people respond to crisis. In The Walking Dead, we see American individualism fracture communities constantly. Shane versus Rick in Season 2. Two men who can't agree on leadership, who both think they're right, who split the group's loyalty. The Governor versus Rick in Season 3. Two leaders who could have cooperated but chose conflict instead. Negan in Seasons 7 and 8, building an empire on domination because he believes strength means controlling others. American culture, with its emphasis on individual rights, personal freedom, and skepticism of authority, it creates survivors who question everything, who don't follow orders easily, who'd rather fight each other for control than submit to someone else's plan. And that individualism, it's both a strength and a fatal weakness. It makes Americans resourceful, independent, creative in crisis. But it also makes them terrible at cooperating, at building the kind of unified response that might have slowed the virus's spread. Now imagine the outbreak in collectivist cultures. Japan, South Korea, China, societies where social cohesion, group harmony, and deference to authority are core values. The theory is that these cultures had an initial advantage. When the government says, stay home, wear masks, follow quarantine, people in collectivist cultures are more likely to comply without resistance. There's less of the American, you can't tell me what to do attitude, less individualism that prioritizes personal freedom over community safety. And in the early days, when containment was still possible, that compliance could have bought time. If Tokyo instituted a strict lockdown and people followed it, if Seoul traced infections aggressively and citizens cooperated, they might have slowed the exponential spread long enough to evacuate key areas, to establish safe zones, to organize in ways that chaotic, individualistic America couldn't. But there's a counterpoint. Authoritarian responses, the kind you'd see in China with its surveillance state and strict social control, they'd face the same problem Operation Cobalt did. When the government's solution involves sacrificing citizens to contain the virus, people stop cooperating. China's one-party system could enforce quarantines brutally, could lock down entire cities, could disappear infected people to prevent panic. But soldiers and enforcers are still human. They have families. And when the order comes to execute civilians, to burn apartment buildings with people inside, to shoot refugees trying to escape quarantine zones, even authoritarian systems fracture. The soldiers desert or mutiny, just like they did in Fear the Walking Dead. Authority without moral legitimacy collapses instantly, whether it's a democracy or a dictatorship. And China's authoritarian response, if it followed the pattern we see elsewhere, would have bought maybe a week of control before everything fell apart, even faster than the US. The emotional weight here is in the absence. We never see Asian survivors in TWD. We never get their perspective, their strategies, their communities. And that absence isn't because they didn't exist. It's because the show's limited to one region, one culture's response. But somewhere in Japan, survivors are building communities based on honor, cooperation, and social obligation. Somewhere in South Korea, they're using technology and coordination to establish safe zones. Somewhere in rural China, villages that barely notice the government's collapse are living much like they did before, adapted to hardship, still farming, still surviving. The apocalypse we see in TWD is an American apocalypse, shaped by American failures and American strengths. And the question that lingers, the one we can't answer because we're not shown, is whether collectivist cultures did better. Did their cooperation save more lives? Or did their density and authoritarian responses kill them just as fast? Both possibilities feel true, and we'll never know which one actually happened. That's the mystery of the red dots on Jenna's map. Each one represents a different answer to the same question, and almost all of those answers are lost forever. Deserts should have been sanctuaries. That's the theory when you look at the Middle East and Africa, at regions where population density is low, where temperatures are extreme, where survival's always been about adapting to scarcity. Walkers, we know from TWD, are affected by environment. In Season 2, we see walkers stuck in mud. In Season 9, we see them frozen in snow. They're corpses, and corpses need moisture to stay mobile. In a desert, where temperatures exceed 120 degrees and humidity drops to near zero, walkers would desiccate fast. They'd dry out. Their tissues would become brittle. Their joints would seize. A walker in the Sahara or the Arabian desert might last days before it's immobilized. Just a dried husk that can't walk or bite. And that's an enormous advantage. In Atlanta, one walker can infect dozens. In a desert, that same walker might not reach anyone before it collapses from heat and dehydration. But the advantage cuts both ways. The same environment that kills walkers also kills the living. Water becomes the ultimate resource, more valuable than weapons or walls. In TWD, we see communities fight over food, medicine, territory. Imagine that conflict when the resource is water. When every well, every oasis, every water source becomes a battleground. The governor's brutality, Negan's extortion, the Commonwealth's class system, they'd all be amplified in a desert where letting someone drink from your well might mean your own children go thirsty. Resource scarcity creates brutal math, and the survivors who thrive are the ones willing to make brutal choices. Nomadic cultures, Bedouin tribes, groups that already lived at the edge of survival. They'd have the skills to find water, to navigate by stars, to move constantly and leave nothing behind. But settled populations, cities like Dubai or Cairo, they'd collapse fast once infrastructure failed and the water stopped flowing. There's also the question of existing conflicts. The Middle East, pre-outbreak, was already fractured by war. sectarian violence, political instability, Syria, Yemen, Iraq, countries torn apart by civil wars, where militias, governments, and terrorist groups were all fighting each other. When the outbreak hit, those conflicts wouldn't have stopped. They'd have intensified. Imagine the Syrian civil war, but now with walkers added to the chaos. Government forces, rebel groups, ISIS, all of them suddenly facing a threat that doesn't care about ideology or borders. Some factions might have cooperated out of necessity. Others might have seen the outbreak as a weapon, herding walkers toward enemy positions, using the dead as biological warfare. The theory is that the Middle East didn't fall to the virus. It fell to the same conflicts that were already tearing it apart, now supercharged by the apocalypse. And the survivors, the ones who made it, they're people who were already living in war zones, who already knew how to navigate violence and scarcity. Africa's even more complex, because it's not one culture or one response. It's 54 countries, thousands of ethnic groups, regions ranging from dense jungles to arid deserts. In Lagos or Kinshasa, massive cities with millions of people, the outbreak would have been catastrophic, spreading fast and overwhelming any response. But in rural villages, in areas where people live in small, isolated communities and travel between them is rare, the virus might have barely registered. A village with no contact with the outside world doesn't get infected unless someone brings the virus there. And in post-outbreak Africa, those isolated villages might be the only places where life continued almost unchanged. They were already self-sufficient, already grew their own food, already lived without electricity or modern medicine. The apocalypse for them might have just been a strange rumor from the cities, something that happened somewhere else. And years later, they're still there, still farming, still surviving, unaware that the rest of the world fell apart. That's the emotional core of this chapter. Survival wasn't distributed fairly. Some people died because they were in the wrong place. Others survived because the apocalypse never reached them. And the world's bigger than the story we see, full of survivors whose strategies we'll never know. South America and Australia are the forgotten continents, the places Jenna's map shows going dark, but the show never explores. And that absence creates space for speculation, for wondering how the outbreak played out in places with different cultures, different resources, different relationships with violence. Australia's particularly interesting because it has natural advantages that should have helped survival rates. It's an island continent, which means controlling entry points, airports, seaports, could have contained the outbreak if the response was fast enough. It has vast interior deserts where walkers would struggle, and it has low population density outside the major cities. Sydney and Melbourne would have fallen fast, no question. But the outback, the rural areas, the communities that already lived isolated and self-sufficient, they'd have had a real chance. But here's the complication. Australia has strict gun control. In TWD, we see over and over that armed groups dominate. Rick's group survives because they have weapons. The Saviours control territory because they have more weapons. The CRM maintains power because they have a military arsenal. In Australia, where gun ownership is rare and heavily regulated, survivors would have had to adapt differently. They'd use bows, melee weapons, traps, strategies that require more skill and more risk. The theory is that Australian survivors would have developed different tactics, less reliant on firearms, more focused on stealth and avoidance. And communities that survived would be the ones that learned to live quietly, to move without attracting walkers, to kill them silently when necessary. It's a different kind of apocalypse than the American one, where the loudest, most armed group wins. In Australia, the quietest group survives. South America's more fractured. You have the Amazon rainforest, where density of vegetation would slow walker movement, but also make human survival incredibly difficult. You have the Andes Mountains, where altitude and cold would affect walkers' mobility. You have massive cities like São Paulo and Buenos Aires, which would have collapsed like any major urban center. And you have political complexity, cartels in Colombia and Mexico, authoritarian governments in some regions, indigenous communities that have minimal contact with modern civilization. The theory is that South America's response would have been regional, fragmented, with no unified strategy. Cartels, which already control territory and have military-grade weapons, they'd have transitioned into warlord factions fast. They'd see the outbreak as an opportunity, a chance to expand control while governments collapsed. And in areas where cartels are strong, survivors would face a choice: submit to cartel rule, flee to the wilderness, or die. Indigenous communities, particularly in the Amazon, they'd have a unique advantage. They already live off the land, already know how to hunt, forage, build shelter without modern tools. The outbreak, for them, might have been distant, a problem affecting the colonizers' cities, but not their territories. And if they maintained isolation, if they avoided contact with infected refugees fleeing into the jungle, they could have survived indefinitely. The apocalypse, in that sense, might have returned parts of South America to pre-colonial conditions, with indigenous communities thriving, while the cities that displaced them burned. There's a quiet justice in that possibility, a sense that the earth reclaiming what was taken. But it's also tragedy, because millions died, and the survivors, indigenous or not, are living in a world that's harder, more violent, more uncertain than anything their ancestors faced. The emotional weight of these forgotten continents is in the stories we'll never hear. Somewhere in Australia, there's a community that survived by learning to live without guns, that developed strategies Rick and Daryl never had to consider. Somewhere in the Amazon, there's a village that doesn't even know the apocalypse happened, that's still living as they always did. Somewhere in Argentina, there's a group that fought off cartels and walkers and built something worth protecting, and we'll never know their names, never see their struggles, never learn what they discovered. The apocalypse we see in TWD is American, shaped by American culture and American failures. But the apocalypse is global, and every continent, every culture, wrote their own version of the story. And most of those stories are lost, buried under silence, visible only as red dots on a map that no one's watching anymore. Operation Cobalt wasn't unique. That's the hard truth when you look at how governments with strong militaries responded to the outbreak. In Fear the Walking Dead Season 1, we see the US military's plan: establish safe zones, promise protection, then execute everyone inside to prevent the virus from spreading. It's called humane termination, which is a sanitized way of saying mass murder. The logic's brutal but clear. Better to kill 1,000 people now than let them become infected and create 100,000 walkers. And soldiers, trained to follow orders, they prepare to do it. But then, as we see in Season 1, Episode 5, some soldiers refuse. They desert. They warn civilians. They choose their families over their orders. And the ones who don't refuse, the ones who follow through, they break. You see it in their eyes, in the way they carry themselves afterward. Following orders that require killing innocents, it destroys you. And when enough soldiers break or desert, the military collapses from within. The theory is that every country with a strong military faced this exact choice. France, the UK, China, Russia, they all would have considered some version of Operation Cobalt. Sacrifice the infected and potentially infected to save the uninfected. Execute civilians to maintain order. Use overwhelming force to contain the outbreak, even if it means killing the people you're supposed to protect. And in every case, the plan would have failed the same way. Because soldiers are human. They have families, friends, moral limits. And when you order them to kill civilians, especially when those civilians aren't monsters yet, just people who might be infected, you're asking them to become something they can't come back from. Some obey and break. Others refuse and desert. Either way, the military collapses, and the authority it represented vanishes with it. The soldier in the tank, the one Rick finds in Season 1, Episode 1, he represents every soldier who followed orders and paid the price. He was locked in that tank, either by his commanding officer as punishment or containment, or by himself because he couldn't face what he'd done. And he died alone, in the dark, and turned into the thing he'd been fighting. That's the cost of Operation Cobalt, replicated across every military that tried it. Thousands of soldiers following orders, killing civilians, and then realizing too late that they destroyed the last shred of moral authority their government had. The emotional weight is in the understanding that these soldiers weren't villains. They were people trying to do their jobs, trying to save civilization. And they were given orders that made saving civilization impossible. Authority without moral legitimacy is just violence. And violence, even organized military violence, can't solve the apocalypse. It just adds bodies to the pile and breaks the people holding the guns. Operation Cobalt wasn't unique to America. It was the inevitable result of trying to solve a human crisis with military force. And every country that tried it learned the same lesson. You can't shoot your way out of the apocalypse. You can only kill trust, and once trust is gone, nothing else matters. Walls work, but only if you maintain humanity inside them. That's the lesson from Alexandria, from the Commonwealth, from every walled community we see in TWD. Alexandria, introduced in Season 5, it's a planned community with walls built before the outbreak, and it survives for over a decade because the people inside chose cooperation over control. Deanna Monroe's leadership in Season 5 and 6, then Rick's. They're not perfect, but they're built on the idea that everyone inside the walls matters, that safety comes from unity, not domination. Compare that to Woodbury in Season 3, where the governor builds walls and fills them with fear, where residents are kept safe but controlled, lied to, manipulated. Woodbury falls because the governor's brutality eventually turns inward, because walls built on control collapse when people realize they're prisoners, not citizens. The Commonwealth, revealed in Season 10 and explored in Season 11, it's the largest community we see. 50,000 people, with walls, infrastructure, even a class system that mirrors pre-outbreak society. And it survives, but barely, and only because Mercer and others inside lead a revolution that forces the leadership to change. The Commonwealth almost fell not because of walkers, not because of outside threats, but because inequality inside the walls created resentment, anger, a sense that the people in power cared more about maintaining hierarchy than protecting everyone. The theory, extrapolated globally, is that walled cities were humanity's best strategy for survival. Evacuate a population center, build walls, establish governance, create sustainability, and many countries tried it. The CRM, shown in The World Beyond and The Ones Who Live, it's proof that the strategy can work. The Civic Republic has 200,000 people, advanced technology, military force. It's the closest thing to a functional government left in the world. But the cost is staggering. In The World Beyond Season 2, we learn the CRM destroyed Omaha, a community of nearly 100,000 people, to cover up failed experiments. They committed genocide to protect their secrets, to maintain their image as humanity's saviors. And that's the dark side of the walled city strategy. It requires deciding who's inside and who's outside, who's worth saving and who's expendable. The CRM saved 200,000, but how many did they sacrifice to do it? How many people were turned away from the walls, left to die because letting them in would strain resources? How many communities like Omaha were destroyed because they threatened the CRM's control? The walls work, yes, but the humanity inside them, the morality that makes survival worthwhile, it's constantly under threat from the very system designed to protect it. The emotional weight is in the realization that Alexandria's survival is the exception, not the rule. Most walled communities failed because the people inside couldn't maintain trust, couldn't balance safety with freedom, couldn't resist the temptation to create hierarchies where some lives matter more than others. The governor's Woodbury fell. Negan's sanctuary fell. The Commonwealth nearly fell. And the CRM, for all its power, Rick and Michonne, had to destroy its leadership in The Ones Who Live because it had become fascist, monstrous, a threat to humanity rather than its savior. The strategy that saved some required sacrificing others, and the question left unanswered is whether that sacrifice was necessary or just convenient. Did the CRM have to destroy Omaha? Or did they choose to because it was easier than coexisting? Did walled cities have to turn people away? Or could they have found ways to expand, to cooperate, to share resources? We'll never know. But the pattern's clear. Walls without humanity inside them are just prisons. And prisons, eventually, collapse or explode from internal pressure. The cities that survived are the ones that remembered the people mattered more than the walls. Every major city tried evacuation, and every single one failed. In Season 1, Episode 1, Rick rides into Atlanta and finds it empty, burned, bodies everywhere, and military checkpoints abandoned. The highways leading out are gridlocked with cars, their doors open, blood on the seats, belongings scattered. Atlanta tried to evacuate, and it failed. In Fear the Walking Dead, we see Los Angeles' evacuation in real time. The military tries to control the flow, to direct people to safe zones. But panic spreads faster than organization. People don't trust the military, don't follow instructions, and the highways become parking lots. And then the walkers arrive, moving through the gridlock, and evacuation turns into massacre. The same pattern played out in every major city globally: New York, London, Paris, Tokyo, Sao Paulo. The plan was always the same: get people out of dense urban areas, move them to controllable locations, establish order. And the plan always failed for the same reasons. First, panic. When people hear evacuation, They don't think orderly departure. They think emergency, danger, get out now. And when millions of people try to leave a city simultaneously, infrastructure collapses. Roads aren't designed for every car moving at once. Bridges become bottlenecks. Tunnels trap people. And once the gridlock starts, it's irreversible. People abandon their cars and try to walk. But walking with children, elderly relatives, pets, it's slow. And slow means you're still in the city when night falls. When the walkers, who've been lurking in buildings and alleys, start to move. The evacuation becomes a death march, and the highways out of cities become graveyards, lined with cars full of corpses. Evidence of the plan that couldn't work, but that every government tried anyway. Second, there's nowhere to go. Evacuating requires a destination, a safe zone where people can be housed, fed, protected. But establishing those zones requires time, resources, infrastructure that's already failing. In Fear the Walking Dead, the military's safe zones in LA are just neighborhoods surrounded by fences, and they're overcrowded within days. There's not enough food, not enough water, not enough medical supplies. And when people realize they've been moved from one dangerous place to another, that the safe zone isn't safe at all, they panic again. They try to leave. They riot. They overwhelm the guards. And the safe zone, instead of protecting people, becomes a concentrated target for walkers attracted by noise and chaos. The theory is that global evacuations failed, not because governments didn't try, but because the strategy's fundamentally flawed. You can't move millions of people faster than a virus spreads. And you can't house them without resources that disappeared the moment supply chains collapsed. The emotional weight is in the understanding that Rick's view of Atlanta, that silent, burning city full of death, it was replicated globally. Every major city became a graveyard. Every highway became a memorial to failed evacuations. And the survivors, the ones like Rick's group who made it out, they're not the people who followed the plan. They're the people who left early, who ignored official instructions, who took back roads and moved fast. Shane got Laurie and Carl out before the evacuation orders, before the gridlock, and that choice saved their lives. The people who trusted the government, who waited for instructions, who believed evacuation would work. Most of them died on those highways, trapped in cars, surrounded by walkers, realizing too late that the plan was doomed from the start. And every government knew it. They had to know. But they issued evacuation orders anyway, because the alternative, admitting there's no plan, no way to save everyone, that's a truth no government wants to speak. So they evacuated, and millions died following. Orders, and the highways are still there, full of rust and bones, monuments to the strategy that every country tried and every country failed. The research race ended in silence. In Season 1, Episode 6, Dr. Jenner shows Rick's group the last moments of his wife's life and death. TS-19, the subject designation. She volunteered to be recorded, to have her death documented, so Jenner could study how the virus affects the brain. And we see it, the brain dying, going dark, and then the brainstem reactivating, the body standing up, animated but not alive. It's the only visual confirmation we have of what the virus does, and it's devastating in its simplicity. The brain dies. The person dies. And something else takes control, using the body as a vehicle, driven by the basest impulses to feed, to move, to spread. Jenner explains that he doesn't know what the virus is, where it came from, how to stop it, and the French, the last other researchers still trying, They've gone silent. The research, race, the desperate attempt by every country with scientific capability to find a cure, it ended in failure. The theory is that research facilities across the world were all trying simultaneously, all competing and occasionally cooperating, sharing data until communications broke down. The CDC in Atlanta, the French facility Jenna mentioned, labs in the UK, China, Russia, Japan, all of them with their best scientists, best equipment, unlimited authorization to do whatever necessary. And they found nothing, not because they weren't smart enough or didn't try hard enough, but because the virus is environmental. Jenna's revelation in season 1, we're all infected. It means the virus is already in everyone. It's airborne, or waterborne, or both. And it's been spreading silently, infecting every human, waiting dormant until death to activate. You can't cure something that's already inside every living person. You can't vaccinate against something you've already contracted. The research race wasn't looking for a cure. It was looking for a miracle, and miracles don't exist. The emotional weight is in the scientists who died trying. Jenna's wife, TS19, she volunteered to be studied because she believed her death could help. Jenna stayed at the CDC alone, recording data no one would ever see, because he couldn't accept that his wife's sacrifice was meaningless. The French researchers, working in their island facility, they kept going until communications failed, until walkers breached their defenses, until they had nothing left. And in every country, scientists made the same choice. Keep working, keep trying, keep hoping, even as the world burned around them, because admitting there's no cure means admitting humanity's doomed, that every survivor is just postponing the inevitable, that death isn't the end anymore, but the beginning of something worse. And some scientists, like Jenna, they couldn't live with that truth. They chose death over hopelessness. Blew up the CDC, ended it on their terms. But some communities accepted it. Alexandria, in season 5 onward, they don't talk about cures. They talk about farming, building, teaching children, creating a life worth living despite the virus. The Commonwealth, for all its flaws, it's built on the acceptance that the old world isn't coming back, that survival means adapting, not restoring. And maybe that's the real lesson of the research race's failure. Hope in a cure was a distraction. It kept people waiting, kept them believing that if they just held on a little longer, someone would fix it. And while they waited, they didn't adapt. They didn't learn to live with the virus. They just delayed the inevitable reckoning. The countries and communities that survived are the ones that stopped searching for a cure and started building something new, something sustainable, something that doesn't depend on defeating the virus, but on living alongside it. The research race ended in silence, not because science failed, but because the question it was asking was wrong. The virus didn't need to be cured. Humanity needed to learn how to survive despite it. And the ones who learned that first, who accepted the permanence of the apocalypse, they're the ones still standing. The civic republic is the best-case scenario, and it's still a nightmare. In the world beyond and the ones who live, we see what organized government response, given enough time and resources, can actually achieve. The CRM has 200,000 people, a standing military, advanced technology, food production, education, culture. It's civilization, rebuilt from the ruins, functional and stable. It's what every country was trying to create in those first desperate weeks. And the CRM actually did it. They evacuated a population, built walls, established governance, and survived. But the cost of that survival, the choices required to build and maintain it, they're monstrous. The CRM destroyed Omaha, a community of 100,000 people, to cover up experiments that went wrong. They've been abducting survivors for years, classifying them as A or B, using them as soldiers or test subjects. And their leadership, shown in The Ones Who Live, they're fascist, authoritarian, willing to commit any atrocity to maintain control and secrecy. Rick spent years trying to escape the CRM, and when he couldn't, he tried to destroy it from within. In The Ones Who Live, Rick and Michonne kill Major General Beale, dismantle the command structure, expose the CRM's crimes. But the organization doesn't disappear. It's too big, too entrenched. There are still soldiers, still facilities, still true believers who think the CRM's methods, however brutal, are necessary for humanity's survival. And maybe they're right. Maybe the CRM's fascism, its willingness to sacrifice individuals for the collective, its ruthless pragmatism, maybe that's what survival requires at scale. Maybe you can't maintain a community of 200,000 without strict hierarchy, without making choices that are morally indefensible, but tactically necessary. The theory is that the CRM represents the logical endpoint of every government's response. Survival through control, order through violence, stability through oppression. But Alexandria survived without becoming the CRM. It's smaller, yes, a few hundred people versus 200,000. But it's survived just as long, and it's maintained humanity, democracy, moral principles. The people inside Alexandria's walls aren't subjects or resources. They're citizens, with voices, with choices, with the freedom to leave if they want. And that difference between the CRM's model and Alexandria's is the difference between surviving and living. The CRM's people are alive, but are they living? They're fed, sheltered, protected, but they're not free. They don't know about Omaha, don't know about the experiments, don't know that their survival is built on genocide and lies. And when they find out, when Mercer and others in The Walking Dead Season 11 learn the truth, they revolt, because survival at any cost stops being worth it when the cost is your humanity. The emotional weight is in Rick's fight against the CRM. He survived the apocalypse, led communities, defeated the saviors, sacrificed himself on that bridge. And then he's taken by the CRM and turned into a soldier for an organization that represents everything he fought against. And it takes him 6 years to find a way out, 6 years to destroy the leadership. And even then, he can't come home immediately because remnants of the CRM still exist. The best case scenario, the most successful government response humanity achieved, it's still a prison. It's still oppression. And the question Rick's story asks is, if the CRM is the best we can do, if this is what organized survival looks like at scale, then did the apocalypse already win? Did humanity lose not when the dead rose, but when the survivors decided that staying alive justifies any cruelty, any sacrifice, any compromise? The CRM is the best case scenario, but it's also proof that maybe there's no good answer to the apocalypse, just different shades of terrible, different costs we're willing to pay. And the ones who survive are the ones who can live with what they've done, or who convince themselves they can. Small communities outlast empires. That's the pattern we see across The Walking Dead's universe. Alexandria, introduced in Season 5, it's a small community, a few hundred people at most, and it's survived for over a decade, through wars with the Saviors, the Whisperers, the Commonwealth. It's been attacked, lost people, rebuilt, adapted, but it's still there. Compare that to Woodbury, the governor's empire in season 3, which collapsed in one season, or the Sanctuary, Negan's industrial power base in seasons 7 and 8, which fell apart within 2 years, or the Commonwealth, 50,000 people with infrastructure and resources, which nearly tore itself apart in season 11 from internal inequality and corruption. The big communities, the ones built on power and control, they're fragile. They collapse fast when leadership fails, or when the people inside realize they're being exploited. But small communities, the ones built on relationships, shared values, cooperation, they bend, but don't break. The theory, extended globally, is that empires died fast, and small communities are what's left. The CRM is the exception, not the rule. And even the CRM is constantly on the verge of internal collapse, held together by secrecy and force rather than genuine loyalty. Everywhere else, across the world, the survivors aren't in massive walled cities. They're in villages, compounds, rural communities of a few dozen or a few hundred people. They're oceanside on the coast, the hilltop in the countryside, the kingdom before it fell. They're small, manageable, personal. Everyone knows everyone. Trust is built through daily interaction, not enforced through hierarchy. And when problems arise, they're solved through discussion, compromise, adaptation, not through authoritarian decrees that breed resentment. Carl's vision, expressed in his letters in season 8, it's a vision of small communities cooperating, trading, supporting each other without any one group dominating. It's not an empire. It's a network, voluntary and flexible, where people choose to work together because it benefits everyone, not because they're forced to. And by season 11, that vision's partially realized. Alexandria, Hilltop, Oceanside, the Commonwealth, after reform. They're cooperating, trading, maintaining independence while supporting each other. It's messy, imperfect, requires constant negotiation. But it's also sustainable in a way the governor's Woodbury or Negan's Sanctuary never were. Because it's built on voluntary cooperation, not coerced submission. People stay because they want to, not because they're afraid to leave. The emotional weight is in the understanding that the question isn't, how did countries survive the apocalypse? Because countries didn't survive. Countries, as concepts, as organizations, they died with the outbreak. The US government collapsed in weeks. France's government fell slightly slower, but just as completely. Every nation-state, every empire, every centralized authority, they're gone. What survived are people, organizing themselves into communities small enough to manage, building trust through relationships rather than laws. And those communities, scattered across the world, they're not trying to rebuild countries. They're trying to rebuild meaning, safety, purpose, on a human scale. Alexandria doesn't fly the American flag anymore. The Commonwealth doesn't claim to be America reborn. They're just communities, with names and identities built on who they are now, not what they were before. And maybe that's the answer to how the world survived. It didn't. The world ended. But people didn't. And the people who made it are the ones who stopped trying to preserve the old world and started building something new, something smaller, something human. The apocalypse killed countries, but it couldn't kill the need to belong, to protect each other, to build something worth surviving for. And that's what's left, 10 years later. Not countries, but communities. Not nations, but neighbors. 10 years after the outbreak, the world's unrecognizable, but not because of walkers. Walkers are still a threat, still dangerous, but they're manageable now. Survivors know the rules, know how to avoid them, how to kill them, how to build walls that keep them out. The real change is in borders. They're gone, not just ignored, but irrelevant. In Daryl Dixon, Daryl's in France, and no one questions how he crossed an ocean or why. In The Ones Who Live, Rick and Michonne are moving between CRM territories, and national boundaries don't exist in any meaningful way. In Dead City, Maggie's in Manhattan, and New York's not part of America anymore. It's just a city, a territory, controlled by whoever's strong enough to hold it. The concept of countries, of nations, of governments with jurisdiction over geographic regions, it died with the outbreak. What remains are communities, territories, survivor networks defined by resources, leadership, and philosophy, not by history or flags. The evidence is in the language. No one in TWD's later seasons talks about America, about France, about being American or French or anything else. They talk about Alexandria, the Commonwealth, the Civic Republic. They identify with communities, not nations. And when they travel, when they encounter other groups, there's no diplomacy, no international relations. There's just the immediate question: are you a threat or a potential ally? The CRM doesn't see itself as America reborn. It sees itself as humanity's last chance, a separate entity with no connection to the country that preceded it. The Commonwealth references American aesthetics, the flag, the imagery, but it's nostalgia, performance, not genuine continuity. The survivors living there don't think of themselves as Americans. They think of themselves as Commonwealth citizens, and that's a fundamentally different identity. The theory is that the world, 10+ years after the outbreak, it's divided like medieval Europe. Small territories controlled by local leaders, with fluid borders determined by strength and negotiation, rather than fixed by treaty. Trade happens between communities, but it's barter, direct exchange, not international commerce. Conflicts happen, but they're local. Alexandria versus the saviors, the Commonwealth versus neighboring groups. There's no large-scale war because there's no large-scale organization capable of waging it. The CRM's the exception, and even they operate in secret, avoiding open conflict with other survivors because exposure would threaten their control. The world's fragmented, localized, and that fragmentation is both tragic and hopeful. Tragic because it represents the total collapse of global civilization, the loss of everything that made humanity a unified species. Hopeful because fragmentation means no one group can dominate everyone else. No empire can emerge to oppress the weak. The emotional anchor is in the flags. In The Hook, we imagined flags lowering, national symbols becoming meaningless. And that's exactly what happened. Flags still exist. The Commonwealth flies them. Communities might display them as decorations. But they're not symbols of belonging anymore. They're historical artifacts, reminders of a world that's gone. Rick doesn't fight for America. He fights for his family, for Alexandria, for the people he loves. Daryl doesn't care about national identity. He cares about Carol, about Judith, about the community that gave him purpose. Maggie's not trying to restore the United States. She's trying to keep Hilltop alive, to protect Herschel, to build something her father would be proud of. The survival we see, 10 years later, it's intensely local, intensely personal. And Carl's question from season 8 What are we fighting for? The answer isn't countries or governments or abstract ideals. It's each other. The people in front of you, the community that takes you in, the family you build from strangers who become friends, who become everything. The world survived, but not as the world. It survived as fragments, as communities scattered across continents, connected sometimes by trade or radio, but mostly just isolated, doing their best with what they have. And that's not the ending anyone hoped for in those first days. No one wanted civilization to collapse, wanted countries to disappear, wanted humanity to fragment into 1,000 separate struggles. But it's the ending we got. And the survivors, the ones still standing, they're not trying to fix it, not trying to bring back the old world. They're just trying to make the new one livable, to find meaning in the ruins, to protect the people they love, to build something small and fragile and beautiful in a world that's vast and broken and full of death. Every country fell, but people didn't. And that's the quiet miracle of survival. Not that humanity endured, but that humans did. One community at a time, one choice at a time, one day at a time. We're back at Jenner's map now, back at those red dots spreading across continents. And after exploring how each region, each culture, each government responded, the image means something different. It's not just countries dying. It's the concept of countries dying. The idea that humans can be organized into nations, that borders and governments and flags mean something permanent. Every red dot represents a moment when a communication center went dark, when a research facility fell silent, when the last organized response collapsed. And we've traced those collapses. America falling to Operation Cobalt and broken trust. France holding out longest but falling nonetheless. Asia and Africa and South America and Australia all going silent in their own ways, for their own reasons. And the pattern's clear. No one won. No country dealt with the virus successfully. They all fell, fast or slow, violent or quiet, but they all fell. But people survived. Not governments, not militaries, not the institutions we thought would save us. Just people, organizing themselves into communities small enough to trust, building walls not to dominate, but to protect, choosing cooperation because domination proved unsustainable. The flags that flew at the beginning, the symbols of nations and identities, they're lowered now, not ceremonially, not with honor guards and speeches, just lowered by time, by neglect, by the understanding that cloth and symbols don't matter when survival requires something more fundamental. The CRM flies no flag. Alexandria's doesn't represent America. The Commonwealth's aesthetics are performance, not patriotism. The survivors don't pledge allegiance to countries that no longer exist. They pledge it to each other, to the communities they've built, to the people standing beside them. And maybe that's the answer to the question we've been asking all night. Did any country deal with the wildfire virus? No. Countries can't deal with apocalypses because countries are abstractions, ideas held together by collective belief. And when the belief dies, the country dies with it. But humans dealt with it. Not perfectly, not without massive loss, not without becoming people they didn't want to be. But they dealt with it. They adapted, survived, found ways to keep going, even when keeping going seemed impossible. Some became the CRM, brutal and efficient, maintaining civilization through oppression. Others became Alexandria, small and struggling, maintaining humanity through cooperation. And most, probably, became something in between. Communities we'll never see, scattered across the globe, writing their own rules, making their own mistakes, surviving in their own ways. The apocalypse was global, but survival is local. It always was. Countries were just a way of pretending we were all connected, all part of something larger. And when the outbreak hit, when the structures collapsed, we learned that connection isn't given by governments or borders. It's built through daily choices, through helping the person next to you, through protecting the community you're part of. That's what survived the virus. Not nations, but neighborhoods. Not governments, but groups. Not countries, but people who decided that staying together, staying human, was worth the cost. And 10 years later, that's still what survival looks like. Not flags or anthems or borders on maps. Just communities, fragile and precious, holding on in a world that tried to erase them. The red dots stopped spreading, but humanity didn't stop. It just became something smaller, more local, more human. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all it ever needed to be.